Captain Jake Morrison sat alone in his small ship as it drifted through the dark space near the Veil Nebula, and his instruments suddenly beeped with an urgent sound that made him sit up straight in his chair because something was sending out a distress signal from a planet below, and he looked at the screen trying to understand what kind of ship could be down there, since no human vessels were supposed to be in this sector at all. The signal was strange and musical in a way that human technology never sounded, and Jake knew he should report this to his commanders and wait for orders. But something in that signal made him think of someone crying out for help, and he had never been good at ignoring people who needed him. So he changed course and guided his ship down through the atmosphere of the forest planet below. Thick trees covered the surface as far as he could see, and smoke rose from a clearing where something had crashed hard into the ground, and as Jake landed his ship nearby and grabbed his gear, he felt his heart beating faster because he had no idea what he would find in that wreckage. The crashed vessel looked like it was made of crystal and silver metal that seemed to glow even though it was broken and scattered across the clearing, and Jake approached carefully with his hand on his weapon just in case this was some kind of trap. But then he saw her. She was the most beautiful and strange being he had ever seen, with long silver hair that seemed to float around her face and skin, that was pale like moonlight, and her eyes were violet and seemed to shine with their own light, and her ears came to delicate points, and she wore armor that looked like it was made from starlight itself. She was hurt and bleeding a golden liquid that Jake realized must be her blood, and she looked at him with fear in those amazing eyes and spoke in a language that sounded like music, but he could not understand a single word. Then something moved behind her, and Jake nearly fired his weapon before he realized what he was seeing, because a creature emerged from the wreckage that looked like the dragons from old Earth stories, with scales that shimmered in rainbow colors and eyes that seemed far too intelligent for any animal. The dragon looked at Jake, and suddenly a voice spoke inside his mind, making him jump in surprise because he had never experienced telepathy before, and the voice was deep and ancient, and said that his name was Vex, and that he could translate between Jake and the Princess Lyria. Jake lowered his weapon slowly and asked if they needed help, and the dragon Vex told him that yes, they desperately needed help because they were being hunted by the Krell Dominion, which was an empire that ruled half the galaxy with cruelty and iron fists. Lyria spoke again in her musical language, and Vex translated her words as she asked Jake the question that would change everything, when she said, "Can you protect me, human?" And there was so much hope and fear in her eyes that Jake felt his heart twist. He wanted to ask more questions and wanted to know what he was getting into, but he could see that she was hurt and scared and that whatever was hunting her would be here soon, so he simply nodded and said yes, he would protect her. Jake helped Lyria to her feet, and she was lighter than he expected, and Vex followed them as they moved toward his ship, and Jake kept scanning the sky because he knew that whoever was hunting this princess would not give up easily. They had just reached his ship when the sky above them lit up with multiple vessels entering the atmosphere, and Jake recognized the design from human intelligence reports as Krell warships, and his blood went cold because the Krell were known throughout the galaxy as unstoppable conquerors who had crushed 100 civilizations. Lyria looked up at the ships and then at Jake with those violet eyes, and he could see that she expected him to run or hide or maybe even hand her over to save himself. But Jake had made a promise, and he had never broken a promise in his life. He got them into his ship and fired up the engines and flew low over the treetops heading for a canyon where he had a hidden supply cache, and behind them the Krell ship spread out to search the forest, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. As they flew, Vex explained more of the situation and told Jake that Lyria possessed knowledge that the Krell Emperor wanted desperately, because her people, the Athari, had created weapons long ago that could reshape entire star systems, and the Krell had been hunting the Athari for generations, trying to force them to give up their secrets. The Athari had mostly died out or gone into hiding, and Lyria was one of the last of her kind, and she carried in her genetic code the key to activating those ancient weapons, and the Krell would stop at nothing to capture her. Jake listened to all this as he guided his ship through the narrow canyon and landed in a cave that he had prepared months ago as an emergency shelter, and he helped Lyria inside while Vex kept watch at the cave entrance. He had medical supplies and he did his best to treat her wounds, even though he had no idea if human medicine would work on her alien biology. But she seemed grateful for his help and smiled at him weakly as he wrapped bandages around her injured arm. That night as Lyria slept, Jake sat at the cave entrance with Vex and watched the sky light up with searchlights from the Krell ships, and the dragon spoke into his mind asking why a human would risk so much for someone he just met. Jake thought about that question for a long moment before answering that he had grown up hearing stories about knights and heroes who protected those who could not protect themselves, and maybe those stories were just fairy tales, but he wanted to believe that people could be better than they were, and that protecting someone who needed help was just the right thing to do. Vex made a sound that might have been a laugh and told Jake that he was either very brave or very foolish, and probably both, and Jake had to agree with that assessment as he watched the Krell ships continue their search. By morning, the Krell had landed ground troops in the forest, and Jake knew that his hiding place would not stay hidden for long, and he began preparing for what he knew would come because the Krell soldiers were coming, and he had only his wits and his weapons and his determination to keep Lyria safe. He looked at the sleeping princess and at the dragon who watched him with those ancient, intelligent eyes, and Jake wondered what he had gotten himself into, but he also knew that he would not change his decision, because sometimes protecting someone meant standing against impossible odds, and he had never backed down from a challenge in his life. The Krell were coming, and Jake Morrison was ready to show them that humans might be small and weak compared to galactic empires, but they were also stubborn and clever and willing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The Krell soldiers moved through the forest like machines with their black armor gleaming in the sunlight and their weapons held ready to fire at anything that moved, and there were 20 of them in this squad, and they had sensors that could detect heat and movement from miles away. Jake watched them from his hidden position on a ridge above the canyon, and he had set up his ambush carefully over the past few hours, while Lyria and Vex waited in the cave below, and he knew that he could not fight these soldiers in a fair fight, because they were stronger and better armed than any human. But Jake had learned long ago that fair fights were for sports and games, and when your life was on the line, you used every advantage you could find. The Krell squad entered the canyon, and their leader scanned the area with his helmet sensors, and Jake held his breath as he waited for the perfect moment, because timing was everything in situations like this. He had rigged the canyon with explosives made from his ship fuel and spare parts, and had set up tripwires and false trails that would confuse their sensors, and now he waited with his finger on the detonator. The Krell moved deeper into the canyon, following the heat signatures that Jake had created using battery packs and heating elements, and they thought they were tracking Lyria, but they were actually walking into a killing zone. Jake pressed the detonator, and the canyon walls exploded in fire and thunder, and rocks rained down on the Krell squad, and half of them went down in the first blast, and the others scattered looking for cover. But Jake had already moved to a new position. He fired his rifle with careful precision, taking down soldiers who were confused and disoriented and trying to figure out where the attack was coming from, and Jake used the smoke and dust to stay hidden as he moved from spot to spot, never staying in one place long enough for them to target him. The Krell commander shouted orders and tried to organize his troops, but Jake had studied their tactics from human intelligence reports, and he knew that they relied on their superior technology and strength and were not prepared for guerrilla warfare. He dropped a net made from steel cables onto 3 soldiers and triggered an electrical charge that overloaded their armor systems, and they fell twitching to the ground. And then he used a distraction device that made sounds like gunfire from multiple directions, and the remaining Krell fired wildly at shadows. Within 20 minutes, the entire squad was dead or disabled, and Jake had not taken a single hit, and he quickly gathered their weapons and communication devices before heading back to the cave. Lyria stared at him with wide violet eyes when he returned, because she had heard the battle and expected him to come back wounded, or not at all. But here he stood with barely a scratch on him and carrying Krell equipment like trophies. She spoke rapidly in her language, and Vex translated, saying that she could not believe what had just happened, because the Krell were supposed to be unstoppable warriors who had conquered countless worlds, and yet this one human had destroyed an entire squad without them ever seeing him clearly. Jake shrugged and said that humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years before they ever reached the stars, and they had learned every dirty trick and tactic imaginable, and sometimes being weaker meant you had to be smarter. Vex looked at Jake with new respect and told him that the dragon could sense something in him that was common among apex predators on many worlds, and it was a calculated ruthlessness that came from understanding that survival sometimes meant doing whatever was necessary. They could not stay in the cave because the Krell would send more troops when the first squad did not report back, and Jake knew they needed to reach his ship and get off this planet before the entire Krell fleet came down on them. He led them through the forest using paths that he had memorized and covering their tracks as best he could, and Lyria struggled to keep up because she was still weak from her injuries, but she never complained and kept moving. They reached the ship as night was falling, and Jake got them inside and fired up the engines. But before they could take off, the scanners showed multiple Krell vessels moving to intercept them. Jake cursed under his breath and changed plans quickly because he could not outrun Krell ships in open space, but he could use the planet itself as cover, and he flew low over the ocean, staying just above the waves where their sensors would have trouble tracking him. The Krell ships followed, but Jake pushed his vessel to its limits and used every trick he knew, and he flew through narrow canyons and over waterfalls and under natural stone bridges, and the Krell pilots, who were used to space combat, could not match his skill in atmospheric flight. One Krell ship crashed into a cliff face trying to follow him, and another pulled up at the last second and lost track of his position. And Jake finally managed to reach the other side of the planet where he had another cache hidden in an abandoned mining facility. He landed inside the facility and powered down everything to make his ship harder to detect, and they all sat in darkness waiting to see if the Krell would find them. Hours passed, and Jake used the time to examine the Krell equipment he had taken, and he found their communication codes and tactical data and maps of their fleet positions, and he realized this information could be valuable to human command. Lyria watched him work and finally spoke through Vex, asking why humans were so good at fighting when they were supposed to be a young species that had only just reached the stars. Jake considered the question and told her that maybe humans were good at fighting because they had to be, and that Earth was a dangerous world where humans had to struggle for everything, and that made them adaptable and stubborn and unwilling to give up even when the odds were against them. Vex said that the dragon was beginning to understand why humans had survived and spread so quickly, despite having no natural weapons or armor or special abilities, and it was because they could think and plan and use tools better than almost any other species. The next morning, Jake contacted Human Command using a secure channel and reported what had happened and asked for extraction, but the response shocked him because his commanders told him to bring Lyria to Haven Station, which was a human outpost at the edge of known space. They said that if the Krell wanted this princess badly enough to send a fleet after her, then she must be important, and that humanity needed to know why and what the Krell were really after. Jake ended the call and looked at Lyria and told her that they were going to Haven Station and that humans would help protect her. But she needed to tell them everything about the Athari and the ancient weapons and why the Krell were so desperate to capture her. Lyria nodded slowly and spoke through Vex, saying that she would tell them everything because Jake had risked his life for her and had shown her that not all species were cruel and selfish like the Krell. They left the mining facility and made a run for the edge of the system, and Krell ships pursued them, But Jake had sent false signals and decoys, and by the time the Krell realized which ship was really his, he had already jumped to hyperspace. As they traveled to Haven Station, Lyria began to tell her story, and Jake learned about the Aetheri civilization that had once ruled a vast empire but had fallen into pride and cruelty and had created weapons that could destroy stars and the dragons, like Vex had been created to judge civilizations and determine if they were worthy of such power. The Aetheri had failed that test, and their civilization had collapsed, and now only a few remained scattered across the galaxy, and Lyria carried the genetic key that could activate the ancient weapons, and the Krell Emperor wanted that key so he could use those weapons to conquer the entire galaxy. Jake listened to all of this and realized that he had stumbled into something much bigger than he had imagined, and that the fate of countless worlds might depend on keeping Lyria safe from the Krellhaven station, hung in space like a small metal flower. And it was home to 3,000 humans who worked mining ice from the nearby asteroids, and it had never been designed as a military base, but that was about to change. Colonel Beth Martinez stood in the command center looking at the reports Jake had sent ahead, and she was a veteran of the border conflicts with pirate clans, and she had seen combat before, but nothing like what was coming. She looked at Jake as he stood beside Lyria and Vex, and asked him if he understood what would happen if they refused to hand over the princess, and Jake nodded and said that the Krell would attack and probably destroy the station. Beth turned to Lyria and asked through Vex if what she carried was really worth starting a war over, and Lyria explained again about the ancient weapons and how the Krell would use them to enslave every free world in the galaxy. Beth was quiet for a long moment, and then she made her decision and said that Haven Station would protect Lyria because humans did not surrender innocent people to tyrants, no matter how powerful those tyrants were. The other officers in the command center looked shocked, because they all knew this meant war with the Krell, but Beth reminded them that humanity had not come to the stars to bow down to empires, and if they had to fight, then they would fight. She immediately began organizing the defense of the station and sent urgent messages to Human Command asking for reinforcements, but everyone knew that help would take weeks to arrive, and the Krell would be here in days. The station had 8 ships that were meant for cargo hauling and ice mining and not for combat. But the engineers and pilots began converting them into weapons using whatever they could find. Lisa Hayes was the best pilot on the station, and she took command of the fighter wing, which consisted of 6 small ships that were normally used to move between the station and the mining sites, and she had her team install missile racks and armor plating and anything else that might help them survive. Marcus Cole was the chief engineer, and he started rigging the ice mining equipment to be used as weapons, and he created giant rail guns from the equipment that launched chunks of ice at incredible speeds, and he also began preparing the station reactor for something that he called his emergency plan. Jake worked with the security teams, teaching them the tactics he had used against the Krell on the forest planet, and he showed them how to set ambushes and use the station corridors to their advantage if the Krell tried to board Lyria wanted to help. And she showed the humans some of the Aetheri technology that her ship had carried, and there were force field generators and energy weapons that were far more advanced than anything humans had. Vex remained by her side, and the dragon told Beth that he could sense the determination in the humans, and that it reminded him of species that had survived great trials, and he said that perhaps humanity was younger than the Krell, but they had something the Krell had lost, which was the willingness to fight for others. 3 days later, the Krell fleet arrived with 30 warships that were each larger and more powerful than anything the humans had, and General Thane commanded the fleet, and he sent a message demanding that Haven Station surrender Lyria immediately or be destroyed. Beth sent back a message that was short and simple, and it said that Haven Station did not negotiate with tyrants, and if the Krell wanted the princess, they would have to come and take her. The Krell fleet moved into attack formation and began approaching the station, and Beth gave the order to prepare for battle, and every human on Haven Station knew that they were probably going to die, but none of them suggested surrender. The battle began when the Krell opened fire, and their weapons tore into the station shields and alarms blared throughout the corridors, but the humans did not panic, because they had prepared for this. Marcus triggered his ice launchers, and massive chunks of frozen water shot toward the Krell fleet at speeds that made them as deadly as missiles, and several Krell ships had to break formation to avoid being hit. Lisa led her fighters out from the station using flight patterns that were chaotic and unpredictable, because humans did not have AI systems that calculated perfect trajectories, and instead they relied on instinct and creativity. The Krell ships tried to target the human fighters, but their targeting computers could not predict where the humans would go next, because Lisa and her pilots flew like they were insane, and they dodged and weaved and made impossible turns that should have killed them. One Krell ship exploded when Lisa flew straight at it and launched all her missiles at the last second before spinning away, and the Krell captain had not believed she would actually do something so reckless. Jake led a team that used the Athari force fields to protect critical parts of the station, and they moved the shields around constantly so the Krell could not focus their fire on one spot. The battle raged for hours, and the humans lost 2 ships, and the station took heavy damage. But the Krell were shocked because they had expected this to be an easy victory, and instead they were losing ships to these supposedly primitive humans. General Thane watched the battle from his flagship, and he could not understand how the humans were doing this, because their technology was inferior and their numbers were smaller. But they fought with a ferocity and unpredictability that his warriors could not match. Marcus Cole triggered his emergency plan and sent a massive electromagnetic pulse from the station reactor that swept across the battlefield and knocked out the electronic systems on half the Krell fleet. The Krell ships drifted helplessly in space as their crews worked to reboot their systems, and Lisa took advantage of the chaos to attack with her remaining fighters, and she destroyed 3 more Krell vessels. Thane realized that he was losing this battle, and he made a decision that shocked his own officers because he ordered the fleet to retreat and regroup. The Krell ships pulled back beyond weapons range, and the humans cheered because they had done the impossible and forced the mighty Krell Empire to retreat. Beth knew this was only temporary and that Thane would come back with reinforcements. But for now, they had won, and they had shown the galaxy that humans could fight. Lyria stood in the command center watching the celebration, and she had tears in her violet eyes because she had never seen courage like this before. And she told Vex that maybe humans were the ones who should have the ancient weapons, because they understood what it meant to protect others. Vex looked at her and said that the test was not over yet, and that the Krell would return stronger than before. But he agreed that humanity had proven something important. Today Jake found Beth after the celebration died down, and they stood looking at the damaged station and the debris field where ships had died, and Jake said that this was just the beginning. Beth nodded and said she knew, but that they had bought time and shown that humans would not back down, and that sometimes that was all you could do, was stand your ground and fight for what was right. News of the battle spread quickly through human space and through the galactic community and other species that the Krell had conquered heard that humans had made the Empire bleed, and some of them began to hope that maybe the Krell were not unstoppable. After all, General Thane sent a message to the Krell Emperor explaining what had happened, and the Emperor was furious because no one had made the Krell retreat in centuries, and he ordered Thane to prepare for a second assault. But this time the Emperor himself would come to oversee the battle. Haven Station prepared for the next attack, and humans from across known space began volunteering to help defend it, and ships started arriving with supplies and weapons, and people who wanted to stand against the Krell. Jake trained the new arrivals, and Lyria continued teaching humans about Ethari technology, and Marcus worked to repair the station, and Lisa practiced new flight patterns with pilots who came from a dozen different human colonies. They all knew that the Emperor was coming, and that the next battle would be even bigger than the first. But they also knew that they had already achieved something incredible, and that knowledge gave them strength. Vex watched the humans prepare, and he told Lyria that he was beginning to understand why his creators had made the ancient weapons so difficult to claim, because power without wisdom was dangerous. But humans seemed to have found a balance. Lyria asked Vex if he thought humans would pass the test, and the dragon said that the test was not just about fighting, but about what they would do when given the choice between power and principle. The Krell Emperor was coming, and the fate of the galaxy would be decided at Haven Station. The weeks after the first battle brought changes to Haven Station that nobody had expected, and Lyria spent her days teaching select groups of humans about Aetheri technology, and she found that humans learned incredibly fast and adapted the ancient knowledge to their own needs in ways that even her people had never considered. Jake was part of the training group, and he watched as Lyria demonstrated a device that could manipulate gravity fields, and she explained that her people had used it for construction, but Jake immediately saw how it could be used in combat or for rescue operations. She showed them energy shields that could protect against weapons and medical technology, that could heal wounds in minutes, and communication systems that worked across vast distances instantly. But there was one thing she would not discuss, and that was the location of the ancient weapons that the Krell wanted so badly, and whenever anyone asked about them, she would become quiet and change the subject. One evening, Jake found Vex alone on an observation deck, looking out at the stars, and the dragon had become less mysterious over the weeks, and sometimes spoke to Jake without being asked. Jake asked Vex about the ancient weapons and why they were so important, and the dragon was silent for a long time before finally speaking into Jake, mined with words that would change everything. Vex explained that dragons like himself were not just companions to the Aetheri, but were actually guardians created by an even older race that had long since vanished from the galaxy, and the purpose of dragons was to judge civilizations and determine if they were worthy of great power. The ancient weapons that everyone talked about were not just tools of destruction, but were tests themselves, and any civilization that found them and tried to use them would be judged by dragons like Vex. The Aetheri had created the weapons long ago when they were young and full of pride, and they had used those weapons to conquer other species and to enforce their will across hundreds of worlds, and they had failed the test completely. The dragons had taken away the weapons and hidden them, and the Aetheri civilization had collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty, and now only a few Aetheri remained, and they carried the genetic keys to the weapons as a reminder of what they had lost. Jake asked why Vex had not mentioned this before, and the dragon said that he had been observing humanity since the moment Jake had agreed to protect Lyria, and he had been conducting his own test. Vex said that he had seen humans fight with courage and creativity at Haven Station, but he had also been watching how they treated Lyria and how they made decisions, and whether they would try to take the weapons for themselves. Jake felt a chill run down his spine and asked what Vex had concluded, and the dragon said that the test was not over yet, but that humans showed promise in ways that surprised him. They were willing to fight for others, even when it cost them dearly, and they questioned their own decisions and tried to find better solutions, and they did not assume that they had all the answers. But Vex also warned that there were humans in command positions who wanted to find the weapons and use them against the Krell, and that desire for power was natural. But it was also the beginning of the path that had destroyed the Aetheri. Jake realized that this revelation created a serious problem, because if the human leadership found out about the true nature of the weapons, they might make decisions that would doom humanity to fail the test just like the Aetheri had. He asked Vex what would happen if humans failed, and the dragon said that the weapons would remain hidden forever, and humanity would have missed its chance to prove itself worthy of such power. But there was something worse, and Vex explained that the weapons were not the only thing at stake, because if humans showed the same cruelty and hunger for power as the Aetheri, then the dragons would mark humanity as unworthy, and other galactic civilizations would treat humans as a dangerous species to be contained or eliminated. Jake understood now why Lyria had been so careful about revealing information and why Vex had been watching so closely, and he knew that he had to tell Beth about this, but he also knew that some officers would not understand the importance of passing this test. He found Beth in her office reviewing battle plans for the expected return of the Krell, and he told her everything that Vex had revealed, and she listened without interrupting, and her face grew more serious as he spoke. When he finished, Beth sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long time. And finally she said that this changed everything, because now they were not just fighting to protect one princess, but were being tested to see if humanity deserved to be treated as equals by the greater galactic community. She called a meeting of the senior officers, and Jake and Lyria and Vex attended, and Beth explained the situation and asked for everyone's thoughts. Some officers argued that they should find the weapons immediately and use them to defeat the Krell because the Empire would destroy humanity if given the chance and power was necessary for survival. Others said that using weapons they did not fully understand was dangerous, and that they should focus on defending Haven Station with the resources they had. One officer named Commander Kate Morgan said that maybe the test was not about whether they used the weapons, but about whether they could resist the temptation to use them, even when doing so would save lives. The debate went on for hours, and Jake watched as the humans struggled with questions that had no easy answers, and he saw that this was exactly the kind of struggle that Vex was looking for. Finally, Beth made a decision, and said that Haven Station would not search for the ancient weapons and would not try to force Lyria to reveal their location, and they would defend the Bach Station and the princess using human technology and human courage. Some officers protested and said this was foolish and that they needed every advantage they could get, but Beth reminded them that becoming like the Krell in order to defeat the Krell meant they had already lost. She dismissed the meeting and told everyone to prepare for battle because the Emperor was coming soon, and they needed to be ready. After everyone left, Jake stayed behind with Beth and told her that he thought she had made the right choice, even though it made their situation harder. Beth smiled tiredly and said that being human meant making hard choices, and sometimes the right thing was not the easy thing, and if they were going to survive in this galaxy, they had to prove that humanity stood for something more than just power. Lyria found Jake later that night and told him through Vex that she had heard about the meeting and about Beth's decision, and that for the first time since her people had fallen, she felt hope that maybe another civilization could succeed where the Athari had failed. She asked Jake if he really believed that humans would stick to this choice when the battle started and lives were being lost, and he said honestly that he did not know, but that he would do everything in his power to make sure they stayed true to their principles. Vex spoke then and said that Jake's answer was more honest than any promise could be, and that the dragon was beginning to believe that humanity might actually pass the test. But the test was not over, and the hardest part was still to come, because the Krell Emperor was bringing a fleet of over 100 ships, and he had sworn to destroy Haven Station and everyone on it. The humans continued their preparations, and they knew now that they were fighting for more than just survival, and they were fighting to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars. Jake spent time training with the security teams and working with Lisa on fighter tactics and helping Marcus with the station defenses, and every moment he wondered if they would be strong enough to win this fight without compromising who they were. The days passed, and the tension grew, and everyone on Haven Station knew that the Emperor was coming and that the final battle was approaching. Then one morning, the sensors picked up a massive fleet entering the system, and it was larger than anything humanity had ever seen, and the Krell Emperor had arrived to finish what General Thane had started. Beth looked at the display showing over 100 enemy ships, and she knew that this battle would decide everything, and she sent a message to all personnel telling them to prepare for the fight of their lives. Jake stood with Lyria and Vex and watched the Krell fleet approach, and he wondered if humans had made a terrible mistake by refusing to use the ancient weapons. But then he looked at Lyria's face and saw hope there, and he knew that some things were worth more than victory, The Emperor sent a final demand for surrender, and Beth sent back a refusal, and the fate of humanity and the test that would determine their place in the galaxy hung in the balance. The Krell Emperor sat on his flagship throne room watching the human station through the view screen, and he could not understand why these primitive beings refused to surrender, and he had conquered 100 worlds, and every species had eventually bowed before his power. General Thane stood beside him and reported that the humans had reinforced Haven Station since the last battle, and more human ships had arrived, but they still only had 20 vessels against the Emperor fleet of 110. The Emperor ordered the attack to begin, and his fleet moved forward in perfect formation because Krell tactics relied on overwhelming force and coordinated strikes, and they had won every battle this way for centuries. But Beth had spent weeks studying the Krell, and she had realized something important about their weakness, and that was their reliance on rigid hierarchy and predictable patterns. She gave the order to execute a plan that Jake had helped design, and it was risky and required perfect timing, but it was the only chance they had. Jake and Lyria prepared to board a small shuttle that would take them toward the Emperor flagship, and officially they were going to negotiate, but the real purpose was something else entirely. Beth had discovered that Krell culture was built on paranoia and backstabbing, and that generals constantly plotted against each other to gain favor with the Emperor, and she planned to use that against them. The shuttle left Haven Station, broadcasting a signal that said Jake wanted to discuss surrender terms, and the Emperor allowed the shuttle to approach because he wanted to see these humans beg for mercy. Jake and Lyria entered the flagship with an escort of Krell guards, and they were brought to a reception chamber while the Emperor decided if he would see them, and during that time Jake planted small devices throughout the ship that Marcus had designed. The devices would hack into the Krell communication network and plant false evidence that General Thane was planning to overthrow the Emperor and take control of the fleet. At the same time, Lisa led the human fighter wing in an attack that looked desperate and suicidal, and the Krell ships focused their weapons on the fighters. While ignoring the real threat, Marcus had rigged several cargo ships to be remote-controlled and filled them with explosives and fusion reactors set to overload, and now those ships drifted toward the Krell fleet looking like debris. The Emperor finally agreed to see Jake and Lyria, and they were brought to his throne room, and he was massive and cruel-looking with armor that seemed to be made of black metal and bones. He looked at Lyria with hungry eyes and demanded that she surrender herself and give him the location of the ancient weapons, and promised that if she did, he would allow the humans to live as servants of the Empire. Jake stepped forward and said that humans did not serve tyrants, and that the Emperor should leave this system before he lost everything. The Emperor laughed and said that humans were amusing in their stupidity, and that he would enjoy watching Haven Station burn. Then alarms began blaring throughout the ship, and reports came in that General Thane forces were moving into position around the Emperor flagship, and communication intercepts showed Thane planning to fire on the Emperor. The Emperor's face twisted with rage, and he demanded that Thane explain himself, and Thane, who had no idea what was happening, tried to deny the accusations, but the evidence looked overwhelming. The Krell fleet began to turn on itself as ships loyal to the Emperor moved to attack, ships under Thane command, and the careful formation fell apart into chaos. At that moment, the cargo ships that Marcus had sent reached the Krell fleet and exploded in massive bursts of energy that destroyed dozens of vessels and damaged many more. Lisa fighters attacked the confused Krell ships using tactics that took advantage of the chaos, and human reinforcements that had been hiding in the asteroid field suddenly appeared and joined the battle. On the flagship, Jake and Lyria fought their way past guards and ran toward the shuttle bay, while the ship shook from weapons fire, and the Emperor screamed orders that nobody followed because the crew was too busy dealing with the internal crisis. They reached the shuttle and launched just as the flagship took a hit from one of Thane's ships, and the Emperor fleet was tearing itself apart while the humans picked off damaged vessels. But the Emperor was not finished, and he managed to restore order to enough ships to form a strike group that moved toward Haven Station, and Jake saw that the Emperor was willing to destroy the station even if it cost him half his fleet. Beth saw the incoming ships and knew that this was the moment when everything would be decided, and she had one last card to play. She broadcast a message on all frequencies to every Krell ship and to the Emperor himself, and told them that humans had discovered the location of the ancient weapons and could have used them to destroy the entire Krell fleet. But humanity had chosen not to use those weapons because power without wisdom led only to destruction, and humans refused to become monsters in order to defeat monsters. She then did something unprecedented and broadcast the coordinates of the ancient weapons to every species in the galaxy, and declared that the weapons were free for anyone to find, but warned that those who sought them would face judgment. The Emperor could not believe what he was hearing because the humans were giving away the very thing he had spent years searching for, and he did not understand why anyone would do such a thing. Then space itself seemed to ripple, and Vex transformed from his smaller dragon form into something massive and terrifying and beautiful, and he appeared in the space between the fleets like a god from ancient myths. His voice spoke into the minds of every being in the system, and he declared that he was a guardian and judge of civilizations and that the Krell Empire had been found unworthy. The ancient weapons activated but not as tools of war, and instead they became instruments of justice, and energy flowed from hidden locations across the galaxy and struck every Krell military vessel. The weapons did not destroy the ships, but instead disabled them completely and stripped away their power systems, and left them floating helplessly in space. Vex declared that the Krell Empire had been judged for its cruelty and conquest, and that it would no longer have the strength to oppress others. And the conquered worlds of the Empire were now free to determine their own fates. The Emperor tried to order his ships to fight, but nothing worked, and he could only watch as his empire crumbled around him. Jake and Lyria landed back at Haven Station and watched as the Krell fleet drifted powerlessly, and across the galaxy reports came in of Krell forces being disabled and conquered worlds rising up in rebellion. Beth received communications from dozens of species, thanking humanity for freeing them and asking how humans had known what to do. Jake found Lyria standing with Vex in his massive form, and the dragon spoke to him saying that humanity had passed the test by choosing principle over power. Vex explained that the ancient weapons could only be activated by those who proved they would not abuse them, and humanity had done exactly that by giving away the weapons instead of using them. Lyria looked at Jake with tears in her violet eyes and asked him again the question she had asked when they first met and said, "Can you protect me?" Human. Jake smiled and said that he thought they had just protected everyone. Vex said that he would remain with humanity as a guardian and guide, and that other dragons would also come because humans had proven they deserved to be treated as equals by the galactic community. The Krell Empire began to collapse as world after world declared independence, and without their military power, the Krell had no way to hold their territory. The Emperor was captured by his own people, who blamed him for the disaster, and General Thane took over what remained of the Empire and began negotiating peace treaties with the freed worlds. Haven Station became famous across the galaxy as the place where humans had stood against impossible odds and won not through force, but through wisdom. Other species began to see humans differently, and no longer as primitives, but as a civilization that understood something important about power and responsibility. Lyria chose to stay with humanity and became an ambassador, teaching humans about the wider galaxy and learning from them. In return, Jake continued working as a surveyor, but now he traveled with Lyria and they explored new worlds together, and wherever they went, people knew the story of how one human had promised to protect a princess and how that promise had changed the galaxy. Beth received a promotion and was put in charge of humanity's first true diplomatic fleet, and she worked to build alliances with the freed worlds and to ensure that humans remained true to the principles they had fought for. Lisa became an instructor, teaching new pilots the tactics that had defeated the Krell, and Marcus continued inventing new technologies by combining human creativity with Athari knowledge. The ancient weapons remained where they were, but now protected by dragons who judged any civilization that tried to claim them, and humanity had no need for them because they had proven their strength in a different way. Years later, Jake stood with Lyria on a planet that had once been enslaved by the Krell, but was now free, and they watched children playing in streets that had known only fear and oppression. Lyria said that she had been wrong when she first asked if he could protect her, because protection was not something one person did for another, but something people did together. Jake agreed and said that humans had learned that true strength was not about having the biggest weapons or the most powerful technology, but about knowing who you were and what you stood for. Even when tested, Vex flew overhead in his dragon form and spoke into their minds, saying that humanity had only begun their journey and that there would be other tests and other challenges. But the dragon said that he believed humans would face those challenges well, because they had learned the most important lesson, which was that power should serve justice and not the other way around. The galaxy was different now, and humans had earned their place among the stars not through conquest, but through courage and principle. And the story of Haven Station became a legend that inspired other species to stand against tyranny. And it had all started with one simple question from a frightened princess to a human who chose to do what was right instead of what was easy.